Questions in our mind. Why is it the mystery of the avatar? Aren't there lots of avatars? Um, and why don't we just say the archetype of the avatar? That would be fine, right? That's a good title. But I think that this idea of it just being a mystery is a good place to keep this idea. And that at the end of the presentation will be just as much of a mystery as it is now. But we will try and say a few things about the idea of the avatar. There are several other upcoming themes for this year that do have to do with great teachers and so forth. And one of the themes, I think that it'll have to do with at the time of the year, later this spring, of the nativity of Rama. So that one's called Rama Avatar. Once again, we'll probably have Manoj Chalam do that one. He is an incredible speaker, Manoj is, and he kind of does a mixture of stand-up comedy and instruction and everything. He's just really a consummate storyteller and so forth. We also have some of the upcoming themes on Krishna Avatar. And then there will be one on Ganesh, which is not an avatar, but so these are the kinds of things. But the Aquarian Almanac also has different festivals. And when Kurt told me that in our public presentations, we ought to do stuff kind of based on the second object, but try and deliver a lot of theosophy in the process. I said, you know what? Let's see what happens if we start doing the themes in the Aquarian Almanac, because they celebrate all these spiritual themes throughout the year. They include Christian themes, themes from Judaism, Islam, all the religions of the world. So we'll be celebrating as we go out, every week, probably some holiday or some festival or some pilgrimage or some season of the year, etc., from throughout the world. So I have a technical question. Is this blue book in your screen the only thing you see, basically, other than you guys' pictures on the side?
Yep.
That's
Okay,
all we see.
Yep, thanks. So you can see in this picture that it's kind of very simply, but in a pure abstract way, showing some kind of a light or heat, like a sun maybe, and then there's some kind of a reflection process. And I'll show you a different slide. Something kind of like that, where you have a light shining down on water maybe, or at least in some kind of a different medium. And all the different emanations, I guess, and the colors. You have the blues, you have the oranges, the reds, etc., at different vibratory rates and so forth. And the idea of this descent of the light shining on this medium of matter somehow, going through these different planes. 1, 2, 3. So you have 6. You actually have 6 shapes right there, and then you have the light. So it could be the 6 principles, you could even say. They could be the 6 principles in the human being. They could be the 6 principles cosmically. But there's this transcendent light that shines down through these different waves, I guess you could say. And here's a quote from HPB, and it made me think of the movie Avatar. She says, all the world's saviors, the bodhisattvas and the avatars, are the trees of salvation, grown out from one seed, the Bija, or Mahavishnu. That's from H.P. Blavatsky in her article, The Doctrine of Avatars. And it made me think of perhaps why the movie Avatar was so popular. Maybe even the word avatar, but even though the movie itself doesn't really have this idea of these great spiritual beings in it, it has the idea of a spiritual people who live in a spiritual place, in a spiritual land. And it's like a pantheism theme, and it's extremely beautiful. It's just a gorgeous movie. But central to that movie is that great tree. And there's several different kinds of amazing trees in that movie. This is called the home tree. And there's other trees of the tree of souls and so forth in that movie. And it just has this idea that there's this living home place, this like home base. And another thing that's really remarkable about that movie is it has the idea that all the trees are part of a central nervous system of the whole humanity that lives on the planet. They're called the Na'vi. But the idea of these trees of salvation, they are actually part of the central nervous system of humanity. And that's, I think, what's remarkable about this theme. From one perspective, it's so high and so sacred that one almost dares not say anything about it. On the other hand, this idea of avatars, of Christs, of bodhisattvas, is so central to humanity that one thinks that if a person is theosophically trying to work for humanity, then a central part of understanding the humanity that one is working for is to try to understand this great theme of the avatars, even though it's always going to be a mystery. And it seems like it's part of the work of the Theosophist to try and understand that idea and help people understand and help ourselves understand that it isn't just one great teacher or one Messiah or one avatar or one savior, etc. There's a whole forest of them, but in some ways they're all part of one tree. And this has to do with this idea of the bija. And HPB in a different slide will go into that more deeply towards the end of the presentation. HPB says that this is in Le Faire l'Inconnu, that article. It's also called in English, The Beacon Light of the Unknown. Every country has had its saviors. Such an one awakens in our benumbed souls the faculty of distinguishing the true from the false by kindling a divine flame hitherto absent, and he has the right to our grateful worship, for he has become our creator. So, as she says, I'm just going to go through some of these different avatars that have been presented to us throughout the ages. Here's an image of Rama, and he is in a category of avatars. First of all, he's one of the avatars of Vishnu, but you can see him in his warrior garb. He's like the perfect, the excellent example of a human being. Here's one of Krishna. He's also in his warrior garb, but he also has other dimensions. Sometimes people think of Krishna as a Purna avatar, and a Purna usually means complete, a total avatar. And interestingly, the idea of the avatar, what does it mean? It means divine descent. So what would be a complete avatar? An avatar who is the most incarnate, the most descended, etc. From what? A transcendental light of the divine, but into the world. So a complete avatar would be one who knows who he or she is, and who is the standard by which the measure would be is the complete marriage and union of heaven and earth. So it's a total incarnation, you could say. And then, and here, this quote here tells why they incarnate. And this is true of all avatars at some level. And this is from Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. I produce myself among creatures whenever there is a decline of virtue and an insurrection of vice and injustice in the world. Thus, I incarnate from age to age. So this shows the cyclicity of this divine descent. All avatars, says Judge in the Ocean of Theosophy, are tied in with cycles, and all cycles are tied in with avatars. And why does the avatar descend from age to age? And that's for the preservation of the just, the destruction of the wicked, and the establishment of righteousness. And you can see the creation, preservation, and destruction in this. So that's the three hypostases of the Atman, you could say. But you have creation, preservation, and destruction. And the destruction is always regeneration for renewal, for the sake of renewal. This is just, actually, this is just me going through a paragraph in the Ocean of Theosophy. He's mentioning all these different beings that could be thought of as avatars. This is King Menes of Egypt, Zoroaster. Some of these images may be kind of, I don't know. And Buddha, also among the Hindus. And we're going to get into the incarnation of Buddha toward the end, because what HPV says about the avatar known as Buddha is extremely subtle. Jesus. We showed Jesus right after Buddha because theosophically, Jesus's teachings are really the same. The ethics are the same as Buddha. And but the life, the actual story of the life of Jesus is said to have been modeled after the life of Apollonius of Tyana. And Judge says that Muhammad, who's the prophet of Islam, can be considered as an avatar. And because all of these beings, you'll notice, are connected with cycles in the destiny of humanity in some way. And believe it or not, Judge includes in the ocean, you may remember this, but there are smaller cycles. So there's large cycles, and I guess you'd call it large avatars. Maybe that word Purna avatar would apply. But then there's smaller cycles. But all these cycles are nevertheless connected with destiny in some way. So in that sense, Judge says that we can include, quote, mixed characters who have had great influence on nations, such as King Arthur, Pharaoh, Moses, and then he says Charlemagne, then he throws this thing in, and then there's a zinger. Charlemagne reincarnated as Napoleon Bonaparte, and Clovis of France, reborn as Emperor Frederick III of Germany. So we're only just trying to say that there's a cyclic dimension and a dimension pertaining to natural law and to moments in history, moments of choice, you could say. And George Washington is mentioned. And the thing about him is that historians have said in different ways that there was some kind of a protective aura about him, that he was like impossible to kill. Bullets would go flying past him. So we've gone from these grand divine beings like Krishna and Rama and Buddha and Jesus and so forth, all the way down to these kind of figures in history. And the one thing One of the overlaps would be the cyclicity. Another overlap might be there's this kind of divine aura about these beings, like even in Arthur, for example, King Arthur, pulling that sword out of the stone, etc. So this is kind of mythical and divine presence about them. Now, I think another dimension of the idea of the avatar is that they are able to affect humanity in ways that other high beings may not be able to so much. What did Jesus do? Let me see where I'm at here. There we go. He was the healer, obviously. He was able to make it so that the blind could see and that the lame could walk. But there's this remarkable sentence from Hermes magazine that says the mark of the avatar is that in him, the paraclete, the spirit of eternal truth, manifests so that even the blind may see, the deaf may hear, the lame may walk, the unregenerate may gain confidence in the possibility and the promise of self-redemption. To me, that is saying that it's a little bit the same as when Robert Crosby, here's an unusual picture of Robert Crosby that I found, was saying that there's a difference between the Avatara and a Siddha Purusha. A Siddha Purusha is a perfect man, or one who has overcome all likes and dislikes, perhaps like the self-governed sage in the Gita, etc. But such a being, although exalted and remarkable, according to Crosby, is like an archaeologist. He removes the dust and lays open an old well, which has been covered up by ages of disuse. So notice how that this archaeologist is working with a structure and a system that's already in place that may need some attention, but it's already in place. The Avatara, says Crosby, on the other hand, is like an engineer who sinks a new well in a place where there was no water before. So what does water symbolize? In what Robert Crosby is doing with this, he's saying that the waters of spirituality, the waters of devotion, the waters of aspiration. In this case, he calls it the waters of piety. He says, great men give salvation to those only who have the waters of piety hidden in themselves. So great men, that would be the Siddha Purusha. But the Avatara saves him whose heart is devoid of love and dry as a desert. So you can see why the millions and millions of humanity love their saviors, because before there's just story after story where they believe that just thinking about these uplifting beings before they were lost and now they are found, that means everything to people. So another thing about the idea of the avatar is, in addition to being able to really touch the hearts of millions and to quicken the karma, really, of improvement or of regeneration, the quickening that St. Paul spoke of, is that they are empowering for not only as a person feel like they've been saved, but they feel that they can help with the message. And there's kind of a logos element to this idea of the avatar. And that's something that we'll try and bring out a little bit later, the descent of the logos, etc. But here is a picture of Jesus he says, to drop your nets, I will teach you to be a fisher of men. So that's saying, don't just fish for fish. Try and spread the good news, etc. And that is kind of the Bodhisattva ideal. Don't just keep the truth to yourself. See what you can do, like what it says in the Voice of the Silence. Find someone even who has even less knowledge than yourself and let him hear the law, etc. And this idea of the fisher of men is a little bit like the idea of the flute of Krishna, because it's the divine voice of Jesus that quickens human beings to look upward and think of a higher cause and a higher purpose to their life. And likewise, the divine music of the flute of Krishna is irresistible. And there he is in his Krishna pose. Really a part of nature. There's also something that I really didn't think it through about all avatars, but there is a similarity between Rama avatar and Krishna avatar, in that as Krishna is to Arjuna, so is Rama to Hanuman. There's this non-dual affection and relation. My understanding is that theosophically, that Arjuna here, who's sitting down in the chariot and he's listening to Krishna, is actually an aspect of Krishna. So there's this idea, once again, like in the diagram that we first looked at, where you have different aspects that are reflecting themselves on different planes. And yet, Krishna is always, he created this whole universe with a single portion of himself, yet remains separate. So that's another thing that is a dimension of that diagram that we first looked at. And yet, there's this non-dual affection and bhakti that is between the disciple and the teacher in this case. And this is the same thing with Rama and Hanuman. And there's this famous kind of beautiful expression from Hanuman to Rama. And he's saying that he's a faithful servant. But look how this works. This has to do with the Manas principle in Hanuman. How does he identify? When I believe I am the body, then I am your faithful servant. Then Hanuman says, when I know I am the soul, I know myself to be a spark of your eternal light. And then he says, when I have the vision of truth, you and I, my Lord, are one and the same. So depending on which level there is of identification is a function of how much the dualism reverts into a complete yoga with the divine, a complete union with the divine. There is a beautiful quote from Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. He was a great Indian scholar. He's one of the most famous scholars in India. While he's resting, he was the first vice president of India, of the modern India, and he was the second president of India. But in some of his commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, he writes, quote, at midnight, in the thickest darkness, the dweller in every heart revealed himself in the divine Devaki. So he's talking about the Gita, and he's talking about Krishna, who says, I am the dweller in every heart. I think there's something like that in the Gita. I forgot which chapter. So he is for the Lord is the self hidden in the hearts of all beings. Now, this glorious radiance arises from the blackest of black nights. In mysteries and revelations, the night is rich. Now, remember that many high beings are born at midnight. We can think of HPB, for example, between the 11th and the 12th of August at midnight. The presence of night does not make the existence of light less real. Indeed, but for night, there could be no human consciousness of light. The meaning of the birth of Krishna is the fact of redemption in the dark night. When the divine birth takes place within us, the scales fall from our eyes, the bolts of the prison open. The Lord abides in the heart of every creature, and when the veil of that secret sanctuary is withdrawn, we hear the divine voice. Receive the divine light. Act in the divine power. The embodied human consciousness is uplifted into the unborn eternal. And now this next sentence he's going to say introduces a vertical dimension and a vertical connectivity. He says, the incarnation of Krishna, that's a descent, right, is not so much the conversion of Godhead into flesh as the taking up of manhood into God. So there's this inherent connection between heaven and earth. So this idea of the taking up of manhood into God has to do with aspiration and reaching upwards. And when that happens, there is such a thing as there's some kind of a voice or mystic energy that is able to descend. This is just a picture of the connection, of the electric connection between heaven and earth. And it's not the same thing, but it just kind of has to do with the dynamic connection between heaven and earth that the avatar brings, that lightning would be an example of this photic bridge-like connection between heaven and earth. So lightning is an electric charge or current. It can come from the clouds to the ground, or it can go from cloud to cloud, or from the ground to a cloud. Negative charges and positive charges attract each other. Thunderclouds are all full of electrical charges connecting with each other. These connections become visible as lightning. Now, on the ground, beneath the cloud's negative charges, positive charges start to build up in a storm. And I'm saying that this is an example of aspiration. The positive charge on the ground concentrates around anything that protrudes upwards, like trees, telephone poles, blades of grass, even people. The positive charges from these objects reach higher into the sky. The negative charges in the thundercloud reach lower. Eventually they touch. When they touch, lightning is created between the two charges. Okay, this is your theosophical quiz question. Who would this be? This is Bhavani Shankar, and on the ULT Phoenix website, his book, The Doctrine of the Bhagavad Gita, is featured. Concord Grove Press also features the book. He's Googleable. He was apparently a chela of the teachers of H.P. Blavatsky. He was an associate of B.P. Wadia. He was also part of the Theosophical Society, and he would give lectures, and people would write down what he spoke about. And some of those lectures were presented in the book called The Doctrine of the Bhagavad Gita. But he is a writer that connects the Gita with the voice of the silence with light in the path. Pretty incredible. He says, this is what he wrote, and talking about this vertical connectivity that we are trying to at least explore. he says the very word avatara implies a coming down. Viewed from the point of view of the Jivan Mukta, which is the aspiring spiritual perfected being, viewed from the point of view of the Jivan Mukta, it is a gradual ascent and the final absorption of the human soul into Ishvara. But from the standpoint of Ishvara, it is a coming down of Bhagavan, and Bhagavan means the divine voice, to the plane of Jivatma. Ishvara, therefore, is not a result of evolution. Ishvara is like the Logos within the cosmos, and it's the God within ourselves. It's the divine voice within ourselves. Ishvara, therefore, is not a result of evolution, but one who makes evolution possible. Hence, Bhagavan says, and Bhagavan is Krishna in this case, in the 6th verse of the 4th chapter, though I am unborn of imperishable nature, and though I am the Lord of all beings, yet controlling my own nature, I take birth through the instrumentality of my Maya. And then Bhavani Shankar explains, he says, Bhagavan, meaning Krishna, controls his Prakriti, having 3 qualities, and through the instrumentality of his light, his Yoga Maya, he incarnates himself. So this is some kind of an attempt at exploring the idea of the divine descent. And it's not, the motivations of such a being are not the kinds of motivations that we can project onto that being from our own experiences. Then he writes more, and he says, this mergence of the Jivan Mukta into Ishvara may be likened to what may happen in the case of the sun when a comet falls upon it. This is an actual photograph of a comet approaching the sun. Now, maybe it's an image. Now that I think about it, how could you get a camera on the side of the sun like that? Maybe you could, I don't know. But this is supposed to be depicting a comet as it's approaching the sun. There is, in the case of the sun, an accession of heat and light. So also, when any particular individual reaches the highest state of spiritual culture, develops in himself all the virtues that alone entitle him to a union with Ishvara, and finally unites his soul with Ishvara, there is, as it were, a sort of reaction emanating from Ishvara for the good of humanity. And in particular cases, an impulse is generated in Ishvara to incarnate for the good of humanity. This is the highest consummation of human aspiration and endeavor. So this implies some kind of readiness on the part of the aspirant who is ascending towards the light and towards the divine voice within, such that, and there's a readiness and a preparation of the soil, so to speak, such that there can be this divine descent. Then he says something else about the light. The light is, as it were, a cloak or a mask with which Ishvara is enabled to make his appearance. In some of the other writings regarding this from HPB, the idea of what we see as avatars is actually an illusion. And this portrayal here of these emanations in, I guess, the lower planes, or maybe in the ocean of life, etc., we're looking at something that we don't understand, but there's a light that's coming. There's a transcendental light that is manifesting in the manifested planes, such that there's a quickening of humanity and aspiration. This is another picture of Bhavani Shankar when he was younger. And actually, it's a little zoomed in shot where he's sitting there with several people at Adyar, what we call Adyar now, at Madras, I think they called it then, of the headquarters of the Theosophical Society. And among the several people that are in that picture is H.P. Blavatsky. Anyway, he says the light is as it were a cloak or a mask with which Ishvara is enabled to make his appearance. But Ishvara, the real center of light, is not visible, even to the highest spiritual perception of man. Hence, in the book Light on the Path, it is said, you will enter the light, but you will never touch the flame. So, now going back to the tree, and we will have Susan read a selected passage that I have asked her to read from this Mystery of the Buddha article. And that, once again, is in the Collected Writings of HPB, volume 14. Susan, you think you could
I'll start right
read
now.
about the tree and the seed and so forth?
Okay. The esoteric version of the mystery given in the secret volumes may be told very briefly. The Buddhists have always stoutly denied that their Buddha was, as alleged by the Brahmins, an avatara of Vishnu, in the same sense as a man is an incarnation of his karmic ancestor. They deny it partly, perhaps, because the esoteric meaning of the term Mahavishnu is not known to them in its full, impersonal, and general meaning. There is a mysterious principle in nature called Mahavishnu, which is not the God of that name, but a principle which contains bija, the seed of avatarism, or, in other words, is the potency and cause of such divine incarnations. All the world's saviors, the bodhisattvas and the avatars, are the trees of salvation grown out from the one seed, the bija, or Mahavishnu. Whether it be called Adi Buddha, primeval wisdom, or Mahavishnu, it is all the same. Understood esoterically, Vishnu is both saguna and nirguna, with and without attributes. In the first aspect, Vishnu is the object of exoteric worship and devotion. In the second, as nirguna, he is the culmination of the totality of spiritual wisdom in the universe, nirvana, I, in short, and has as worshippers all philosophical minds. In this esoteric sense, the Lord Buddha was an incarnation of Mahavishnu. Each human being has, moreover, his own divine spirit or personal God. That divine entity or flame from which Buddhi emanates stands in the same relation to man, though on a lower plane, as the Dhyani Buddha to his human Buddha. Hence, monotheism and polytheism are not irreconcilable. They exist in nature.
Thank you very much. I think, just in closing, we've tried to point out some commonalities that exist in the different traditions about respective avatars. We hope that, I think that one of the theosophical messages is that even though there's no personal God, there's still a logos. And there's a logos in the cosmos, there's a logos in nature, and there's a logos in man. And the higher self is really the logos within ourselves. And that's the voice within. And what is true cosmically about the divine descent is also true within each human being existentially, that there's aspiration, and then there's the unlocking of the spiritual potential within each monad. And Theosophy seeks to prepare the ground for that purification and attenuation and focusing the attention on that which is life-giving, and that will seed the cloud, so to speak, and feed the starving millions of humanity.
Thank you.
So what do we do now, Kurt? We've got a few minutes. We have time for questions if there's.
We have a question on the chat. I believe it was Jeffrey Jeffrey Clark. If you want to speak out, Jeffrey, you can do that. Or if you want me to read it, that's fine too. You're able to unmute if you wanted to.
Okay. So you said that HBB says that the avatar is, what we see as an avatar is an illusion. But why is that any more an illusion than anything else that we see on the manifested planes? Is it just her way of saying there's a lot more to the avatar than what we see with our physical eye? Is that sort of the idea?
I think that's a really helpful question. She does say in one sentence in that Mystery of the Buddha article, she says that there's actually, she addresses your question. She says, she acknowledges your question. She anticipates your question, we'll put it that way.
Oh, good.
So, she saw you coming. But basically she said that there's more than one kind of illusion and that the avatar is a special kind of illusion. Not that I could explain what she says about that, but I'm hoping that this diagram is a little bit of an idea that that there is some kind of a divine descent of some kind of energy of the transcendent releasing some small portion of itself and remaining separate. There's always that which is transcendent, and yet, due to the compassion and the sacrificial descent, there is some kind of a descent of an energy that sends out a quickening energy in the universe. So, I think the other thing about the illusion is that in the statistic that Krishna gives, he says, and somebody can help me with getting this quote more accurate. He says, really only 1 in 1,000 tries to understand, tries to seek wisdom, really tries to seek wisdom. And yet of those 1 in 1,000, only 1 in 1,000 of them know me as I truly am. So maybe the first 1,000 would be the first kind of illusion that you talked about. And the second 1,000 would at least be the people who are trying to figure out the mysterious nature of Krishna. In other parts of the Bhagavad Gita, he says that he indicates that people try, that really understanding the nature of Krishna is just impossible. And and you cannot project anything of our own shadow onto the nature of an avatar, really. Their motivations, their timing, what they're doing, and what's going on.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah. As you're talking, I thought, in Buddhism, the very first sutra in the Buddhist canon sort of takes up that same question. And the Buddha begins by saying, well, a lot of people, what do you think of the Buddha? How do you understand me? And people think, oh, the Buddha's very kind. He's a good speaker. He taught me this. But he says, then he goes up, the ladder, sort of like what you're talking about, up like these 6 ladders, and shows the Buddha has this sort of cognitive difference that makes him really different from everybody else. And so that was, I have another question, if I may. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. That quote, Bhavan Shankar quoted, is that the voice of the silence that says you can penetrate to the light, but you can't touch the flame?
Oh yeah, that's in the Light in the Path.
Light on the Path, yeah, okay. Well, you know, so many traditions talk about seeing the primordial light. And this is saying that this isn't saying that we can't see the that we can't see the primordial light. It's saying that we can't touch the flame, which I think is different. I'm not sure what his point is, that the real center of light is not visible even to the highest spiritual perception. Maybe, I mean, what Subarao says is that even to the logos, that is the highest, you know, the Ishvara, that Parabrahm is invisible, that Ishvara cannot see Parabrahm. But is it in Indian tradition that we can't see Ishvara?
I think you're onto something. I think that, like in our San Diego study class on Sunday mornings, we've been reading the very beginning of the introductory and the proem of the Secret Doctrine. And it's interesting that there's a lot of pages before she even gets to the three fundamentals. And there seems to be a preparation of the ground of the mind. And one of the things that she seems to be doing is to get us to be able to get us to think philosophically. She'll say, this is philosophical, or that's not philosophical, things like that. And then she'll say things, but basically what she's getting us to think about is the transcendent versus the immanent. And like, for example, she'll talk about the Advaita Vedantins, are the ones that really have it figured out with relation to the first fundamental. The Parabrahm, they would say, is the only reality, and everything else is illusion. Now that is pure philosophy.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, once you've gotten the idea of the transcendent and the immanent of deity, and then our first fundamental is that which is absolutely eternal and indescribable and unlimited and boundless and all that. Once you've gone there, then I think you're better prepared for thinking about the mystery of the avatar, because there's always going to be that which is transcendent, even though there is that which becomes, on a cyclic basis, becomes immanent. So like in this diagram here, see how that light, that flame, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't touch it. It's the abstract, always ever receding, transcendent light of some kind. And yet you can touch all these other lights, perhaps, by going through your own six principles and so forth. We're experiencing vibratory rate at those levels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great.
I'm wondering if I could comment on those two excellent questions.
Yeah, please.
And first of all, Jonathan, thank you for a magnificent presentation. I was very touched by many parts of it, particularly as you were trying to explain this idea of this union of Hanuman and Rama as being kind of the archetype of that union that occurs through love. But Jeffrey, those were such excellent questions. I thought that there were also key points that came to my mind. And I just wanted to, not that I know the answers at all, but just to offer a couple of short thoughts, one on each question. One is that what seems to be part of the special nature of the illusion that the avatar projects in order to participate in human evolution is that it's self-consciously created at every level, right? That there's a complete mastery of that whole process of descent, which humanity for the most part does unconsciously. Yeah. So there's a an understanding, complete understanding and transcendence of the whole process, and then a willing participation in the descent at each level. And like we have in Buddhism, this whole idea that, at the higher levels, such beings are part of a prototypical reality, an immortal reality in nature, that then differentiates like rays, in a sense, into particular incarnations. So that whole process apparently is one that's done consciously, self-consciously.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just one thought. And then the other question, which I've also been puzzling about, is, and probably we all have at one point or another, but that it seems like what is being spoken of there is that the highest reality cannot be made an object of perception. So like it said in this quote, it says that that light is not visible even to the highest spiritual perception of man. So as long as it's an object of perception, we're always going to be seeing an illusion. But, as they talk about in the Upanishads, that highest form of vision, of consciousness, is where seeing and the process of seeing are united. So there's no more object and subject. There's no more differentiation. There's no more self and other. And that's why it can't be spoken of as being an object of knowledge, is because the subject and object are obliterated in that knowledge, in that awareness or understanding.
That's
Just
beautiful.
Perhaps one thought.
If I could pick up on that, Kurt, on the first one that you said, that as Bhavani Shankar, that Krishna controls the Prakriti, and that it has of the creative preservation and destruction, which is regeneration, controls. So in other words, it's a deliberate descent. So it's not, they say that the avatar has no karma. That's another thing. Well, how could that possibly be? Because they're not sucked into the system like the rest of us are. In other words, we have, tanha and the thirst for existence and all this stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's where we are. But there is such a thing as beings who come into incarnation out of just obedience to the law, really. And that's what compassion is compassion absolute, the law of laws, and so forth. Now, there is a thing in thinking about the idea of the avatar, which one might get queasy about and think, what happened to theosophy here, and what happened to self-induced and self-devised efforts, and what about thinking for ourselves? And we're just going to wait around for the avatar to come here and clean up the mess that we're in? And where's the responsibility in that? But I can only try to answer that question in a paradox. The Gita talks, probably there's no other spiritual document that provides more clues to the idea of the mystery of the avatar than the Bhagavad Gita. You learn so much about the true heart and nature of Krishna, and with Arjuna's questions, etc. And yet, it's the book. What does Judd say in his commentaries in the beginning, in the preface? The Gita inspires action and selflessness, I think. So it's engagé. It's be engaged. Do stuff. Don't hide in a cave. Be part of humanity. And that's what Judge seems to be exemplifying in his whole life. He was like that. He was a person of action, like Arjuna, and yet he was, super wise, but super full of action, always taking advantage of opportunities to help others, and so forth. So, so here you are, and then I think it's the third or the fourth chapter. I think it's the third, where Krishna says, "If I were not constantly engaged in action, then the whole universe would slow down and peter out, basically. So, and Krishna says at the same time, I don't need to engage in action. There's nothing I need to do, really, but I engage in action. So interestingly, the Gita becomes, it's very theosophical in the way that we are implored to deliberately engage in life and in relationship and in humanity and in karma. Karma yoga. Karma is different. Karma yoga is different than just karma, right? And so the difference between those two has something to do with the mystery of the avatar. And Monica?
Thank you. I was wondering if it would be possible to get by way of email the Rama and Hanuman passage that you put up a little while back, and
Yeah.
also the passage that Suzanne read. Would it be possible to get that by way of email?
Yeah, Kurt, how does that work? We have the email list, right? Do you want to just, does everybody on the list want that, or at least the people that participated today, perhaps? Kurt, how would that work? Kurt Fulkent.
Thank you.
We have time for perhaps one more question or one more comment.
I think I have a comment.
Okay.
So I'm looking at this and thinking about the question that Jeffrey put up, right? It's basically in the light on the path. He's saying you will enter the light, but you will never touch the flame, right? And then you look at this picture of the book cover, and you have the septenary nature of man, right? However, the sun on top is not really part of it because it is sustaining it. So it is part of us, right? It's part of the soul. And so in the soul lies the flame. But once you try to touch the flame, you'll never get to it, right? Because it's the spirit kind of like overlays everything. It's the gel that glues everything together. So it cannot be apart from anything within creation. That's how I'm understanding this.
Yeah, the Atman pervades the all levels of Prakriti, you could say, but it's also the synthesis. And there's something mystical about this idea of the synthesis. The synthesis isn't that which gets put together with so many disparate parts, and now you have a synthesis, because if that was a synthesis, there'd be no difference between a synthesis and a pile of stuff. A synthesis is something that was fundamentally a unity prior to the differentiation. And the continuing integrity of that unity that pervades throughout the system, that's the synthesis. And it has to do with electricity and magnetism, it seems like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Have a good week.
Namaste.
See some of you tomorrow.
Yep. Get on the other side.